They're just going to do what they want anyway. And that's sometimes what writing a poem is like.
It's got to sound good to the ear, and then it's really got to get at something essential in the most like precise language possible.
But it's that first time where you have this other intelligence saying, "Hey, I disagree with how things went," which was all of a sudden it's not something that you own as the writer anymore. It's sort of like, oh, it's somebody else I have to consider.
Other than just the echo of the and jump to scum.
Hello, welcome to the Coach House Podcast, episode lucky number 13. We have a great episode for you today. Poets Catriona Wright and Matthew Tierney talk about creating poems after creating life. But first, we have a very special piece with writer Pasha Malla. Most novels are a series of chapters, and chapters are made up of paragraphs, and paragraphs are made up of sentences. What makes sentences the basic, most important building block in literature? And what exactly makes a good sentence? We asked writer Pasha Malla to pick his favorite sentence and tell us why. Pasha, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Pasha. I'm the author of the newest book is All You Can Kill. Here's some stuff about Kill Them All, my last novel. Goodreads reviewers called it ridiculous, not worth engaging with, meritless and completely idiotic, maddening and jarring, not particularly enjoyable, irritating verbose nonsense, insane and impossible to follow, very strange and downright silly, too absurd for my liking, and the worst book ever. So I hope this one's more of the same.
This is already the best bio we've ever had on the podcast, so thank you for that. And we're here today to actually talk about, not you, we're here to talk about sentences and someone else's sentence in particular and what makes a good sentence. So I know this is a very general question to start us off, but what makes a good sentence, at least for you? What do you look for? What are the elements that make up a good sentence that really hit it for you?
I don't know. I mean, sentences in fiction can serve so many purposes. But, I mean, I think when we talk about, like, if you're isolating a really good sentence from a piece of work, it's kind of, in order to stand on its own, maybe, it's got to have, for me, musicality and precision. And I think those are the two things that when you asked me about this, I was like, okay, and I thought a couple of things came to mind before I settled on this Helen Garner line. So yeah, I think it's got to sound good to the ear, and then it's really got to get at something essential in the most like precise language possible.
I'm going to ask you to read this sentence, but before I do, could you introduce it? Who's it by? What book is it from? And could you just tell us a little about what you like about it?
Yeah, for sure. So this is from Helen Garner's novel, The Children's Bach, or Bach, if you want, which is an incredible. It's an incredible novel, Australian writer Helen Garner. And what do I like about this sentence? You want me to read it?
If you want to read it first, then we can talk about it after. Why don't you do that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Honored even. He was an old-fashioned, joyful whistler who loved merry trills. And as he approached the climax of the melody, he stopped walking, turned to Athena, and raised one crooked forefinger to alert her to his impending triumph. Yeah, I just love this line.
Specifically, what is it that you like about this one?
I love that it's in sort of three parts. It's a sentence kind of like with three acts, like separated by, three kind of clauses separated by commas. And the first kind of introduces the character as he was an old-fashioned, joyful whistler. And I just think, like, I love adjectives that are at once, like, vague and specific in context. So, like, old-fashioned can mean all kinds of things, but, like, paired with joyful and then with this noun whistler, it becomes this whole kind of characterization that I think we start to get a sense of who this is. And then there's like a nice like little piece of phrasing, who loved merry trills. So we have this, this kind of like a sketch of this maybe anachronistic character and something he's passionate about. So the sentence already has like this kind of energy to it. And then there's a comma that kind of stops there. So he was an old-fashioned, joyful whistler who loved merry trills, comma, and it allows us to like pause on that just as like a piece of characterization. And then it moves into the second act of the sentence, and there's action. And as he approached the climax of the melody, he stopped walking. And there's a comma there too. So what I love about the phrasing here is it's paired with like stuff happening in space and time. So he's walking. So there's movement. So there's something for the reader to kind of like visualize. And I also think it's really effective when you have two senses, like the visual and the auditory, I guess, here. So we get the melody and the movement and the pause. And then the pause, he stopped walking, happens. And then there's another comma before it sort of moves into the third part. But I love also that there's something narrative about even the song that he's whistling. I mean, it's a melody, which even kind of like, it doesn't seem like a song. It seems like a snatch of a song or like a little phrase from a song. And it has a climax. And then there's this final part of the sentence where he turned to Athena. So then there's this kind of like addressee or someone who's listening or someone who's forced to listen, a companion to the person, as though he stops her like in her tracks and raised one crooked forefinger. And I just love that the use of the adjective crooked there. And it's just like such a specific piece of visual information. And then the forefinger, and to alert her to his impending triumph. And like the irony of that, like we suddenly are shifting into Athena's kind of like eye-rolling perspective on this whole thing. And there's like a turn at the end of the phrase, like sort of like a poetic volta, and it lands on like kind of, I guess, like a subtle joke. So I just think there's so much shit going on here that is awesome. Like on a linguistic level, narrative level, character level. There's, like little, phrases like merry trills. There's something sonorous there happening with the kind of like paired R's. So there's like a musicality to it as well. So yeah, I just think this is a great line. What do you think of it? Do you like it?
I do. I love it a lot. I'm not familiar with this book, I have to admit. I do know Helen Gardner, but I have not read this. So without any context for myself as well, what I'm struck by is what's really funny to me is, right away we're getting the old-fashioned joyful whistler, but the sentence, the language in it, the words feel kind of old-timey too sometimes. Like everything from merry trills to the crooked finger, his impending triumph. I don't know. It feels dated in a very funny way, that even if this story isn't at a different time period, we're getting the feeling this guy is.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe Athena isn't.
Yes.
Right? Like there's a tension between her position. And I mean, there's like, obviously context in the paragraph and in the novel about their relationship and the kind of like tensions in their relationship and her kind of like dawning realization that this guy's a bit ridiculous. And there's just like all of that kind of crystallizes in this line. I said I wasn't going to give any context, but I mean, and yeah, I just like the way in which, it's like his ridiculousness comes out here is just so artfully done, like it's not overly explained. It's all kind of like dramatized, it's imagistic. It's great. I love this line. I think it's really good.
You mentioned beforehand that there was actually another sentence. There was another sentence that popped into your mind before this one. I know what that sentence was. I wonder if we could visit that quickly and talk about why you chose this one over that one.
Yeah. It's a line from Portrait of the Artist as Young Man by James Joyce, like obviously maybe better known than Helen Garner. And I don't know why. This is like a sentence that's like stuck in my brain since I first read this book like 25 years ago or whatever. And the line is, and a fellow had once seen a big rat jump plop into the scum. And you know what? It's got something similar here. Like, and I know, I mean, obviously the book was written, 100 years ago? Close to that. Mm-hmm. So it's of a different time. But there's something in this kind of like these like anachronistic British isms, like the use of the word fellow to describe a child. I still find that like there's just like a little bit of humor to it that like gives the sentence a kind of lightness. And in context, it's like about a kid experiencing like all kinds of alienation and not knowing how to fit in a group of people and feeling like everything he's done is wrong and he's like, been pushed into this puddle. But I just love those 4 words together: big rat, jump, plop. And then the way the sentence kind of like rounds out with that that echoes the and jump. Like there's a wonderful musicality to this line, and like a real like onomatopoeic quality too, and just those blunt, monosyllabic big rat jump plop, before we get 2 syllables like into that creates a kind of rhythm that allows us to land on the 2 monosyllabic the scum at the end. There's just it's just such a well-crafted sentence.
For me, it's the jump to scum too.
Yeah.
Like to have that connection at the end really is, there's something sonically very satisfying about that.
Yeah.
But to be honest, until you read the sentence, this is one of those sentences in a very Joycean way I had to really look at to sort of make sense of. Like, though grammatically it's correct, seeing big rat jump plop in a row is a little disorientating.
Yeah.
Disorientating.
And I think, that's the kind of like destabilizing, just like syntactical destabilizing. Like I really like in these moments in fiction where the character is destabilized. So it's like just a slightly janky syntax, and like grammatically correct, sort of. The jump plop, it's not an adverb. It's a kind of like, like an onomatopoeic description of the sound. So it like moves from the verb to a noise, and then like gives us this like, I don't know, is there a better word this could have landed on than scum?
Yeah.
Other than just the echo of the and jump to scum, and the P's of jump plop. Like it's like, yeah, I don't know, the kind of like internal music to it is just so beautiful. Yeah. And like creepy.
Yeah, it is. Again, out of context, this sentence feels menacing, more menacing than it is in the book itself, which it is in the book. But
yeah, for sure.
Just to wrap us up here, Pasha, we've been talking so much about sentences, and I know you teach as well, and you have students, and you talk about writing a lot, and you're a writer yourself. But when you're writing sentences, or when you're coaching someone on writing sentences, everything we talked about today, is this going through your head? Are you thinking about this while you're constructing a sentence, or is it more about instinct for you?
Depends what I'm writing, I think. And I think that so much of what I do is like voice driven. I mean, this new novel is like very much, the momentum of the writing was carried by the voice. So I think that, I like to tell students, like, the more you read, the more this stuff just like kind of like exists in your brain and you can access it more and more naturally. So I want to write non-ugly sentences. I want to write sentences that emulate the sentences I love the most. And I don't know how conscientiously I'm trying to do that on the front end, but I'm definitely thinking about it in editing. So it's like voice driven on the front end, and then when I go back in, that's when I kind of like really try to fine tune things. Like, and again, I think like especially in All You Can Kill, like I was just guided by trying to like bring the voice of the narrator out in a way that created tension between how he was describing what he was describing. So like that was like, finding janky ways to phrase things like this Joyce line was really important too. Like just like phrasing that felt a little bit off, like syntax and rhythm that feels a little bit off. And maybe just using like occasionally like the wrong word for things. So yeah, I kind of want there to be like tension within the sentences in that book too.
If you ever do write a book about writing, you should call it Janky Sentences, I think.
The jank. I'll just call it the jank.
The jank method.
Yeah, that's right. That's good.
Pasha, thank you for being on the Coach House podcast.
Thanks so much, James. It was good to chat with you.
Inspiration can come from anywhere. Can it even come from creating kids? We spoke with Coach House poets Catriona Wright and Matthew Tierney about writing about kids and what it can teach us.
Okay, here we go. Catriona, can you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Catriona Wright. My book is Continuity Errors. It came out last May with Coach House Books. Before that, I had written 2 other books, one called Table Manners, a book of poetry, and Difficult People, a collection of short stories. That's about all you need to know about me.
Matt, can you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Matthew Tierney. I'm an editor for Coach House Books. I have just published my 5th book. Came out this spring. It's called Lossless. So I've been with, I've had about 3 other books with Coach House now. So that's about it.
Okay, well, I wanted to have you both on this podcast today. Thank you for joining us because, Matt, you have a new book, a new collection of poetry out, Lossless, and you also edited Catriona's book, Continuity Errors, which is now shortlisted for the Trillium Book Award for Poetry. Big applause.
Yay!
Usual, you can't see it, audience, but there's lots of applause here. And we wanted to get you on a conversation because I think you both have some things in common for this. Who knows, Catriona? By the time this episode comes out, we'll know for you will not be shortlisted anymore, one way or the other.
True.
But to start off, I wanted to ask you a question because both your books deal with parenting and kids. And I know both of you have written books before these collections and books that didn't have to do as much with parenting and children as well. So, and I wanted to ask you, obviously, you came to writing about children and parenting through being parents yourselves. But not everyone who does have a kid ends up writing about this stuff. So I wanted to ask you both, what drew you to writing about parenting and children? Catriona, could you start?
Sure. Yeah. So I'd written several poems that ended up in Continuity Errors, but a huge amount of them were written during the pandemic when I was pregnant, and there wasn't a lot else going on. So that was kind of how I came to be writing about it. Like the book has less to do with, for me, about parenting than about like the pregnancy and just immediately after the birth, kind of the newborn stage. I am writing poems about parenting now, but it was basically, we were all pretty isolated. That was the most interesting thing going on. And it is this very alien, strange thing. That's how I came to be writing about it.
Do you think now that your child is born, that you would have, in the poems you're now writing about having an actual out of the womb kid, how different are they now, do you think? I mean, obviously there's a huge difference, but in terms of how you approach the subject, are they coming easier? What's the difference?
Well, yeah, I guess so much of the, being pregnant is just sort of trying to search into the future and anticipating what might happen and thinking of all the possibilities and things like that. And now you're dealing with, you don't really have as much time at the very beginning to do anything but deal with the day-to-day reality. So maybe they're more kind of present tense than they were in the past.
I remember being at the stage, just to jump in here, where they're really young and all you have is your imagination, right? Like they're still humans, but they're not really they don't have a personality. You don't have to sort of deal with them on that level. And so all you do is think about, the future, what's going to happen, that's right. And your poems speak to this quite a lot about, I hope you like your name, that kind of thing, like I love that line. But yeah, so it's just a question of like your head gets filled with all the potential paths that might happen. And so you end up, that's great fodder for poems, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. And it's sort of like writing a poem. You try to control it and think you can control all these things, and then they come out and they just are their own person and they surprise you all the time. So you realize how little you can control is what I've come to realize, that they're just going to do what they want anyway. And that's sometimes what writing a poem is like.
Matt, your situation for having a kid was a little different. Would you mind talking about that and how you came to write poetry there?
Yeah, so my wife and I had fertility problems, so we were trying to have a child for 8 years. And that was its own journey, right? And that was complex, and it's existential in very literally, because you're trying to create this new life and you can't, and it seems like whatever comes naturally to other people is not coming naturally to you, and it's there's a whole path there, which I have written about as far back as my second book, is when we started, but then of course there's the whole path to adoption, which is what a lot of this book, Lossless, deals with, that path as well. So it's taken a huge chunk of my life, this whole thing. And of course, going through we adopted Augie when he was born. So we knew Tummy Mummy, we call her. Prior to that, we met her. So for that 11 years, and I have that in this book as well. I guess it's probably about 8 by the time the book gets done. So Augie from 0 to 8, plus all the past leading up to him. So it's sort of a unique, or not unique, I shouldn't say unique, but it's a rare way to make a family. It's funny because I was at a reading just recently in Fredericton, and an old friend, an old classmate of mine came up to me, and she had a 17-year-old adopted daughter, and she was talking about there's sort of like not a lot of poetry in this area, and she was throwing around ideas of maybe making an anthology or something just to give voice to this kind of uncommon path to familyhood, I guess.
Both of your books document a certain time. Like obviously Catriona documents your pregnancy, and Matt during the conception with Tummy Mummy and everything. Yeah. But it's almost like you're left with like a photo album of a certain time. Did you revisit your books afterwards? Do you have like different thoughts on them now? Because unlike a photograph that you just take and then you have permanently, these poems can change for you over time. So I guess I'm wondering if there was some reflection after your kids have grown a little to look back on the writing you did about them and reconsider it. Matt?
So because Augie is now becoming cognizant of what I do, like he was aware that I was a writer, but he didn't really know before with the previous book, which was 6 years ago. So he would have been about 6. But this year he came to my launch, for example, and I read a poem, and I tried to warn him in advance. I said, you're in these poems, and sometimes exactly what he says. And I read a poem where he says this line, Dad, no one believes I'm a ninja. He gets a laugh, and I move on. And then after the reading, he came up to me and said, Dad, I never said that. But of course, I had written it down the day he said it, right? Like I have the receipts, But it's that first time where you have this other intelligence saying, hey, I disagree with how things went, which was all of a sudden, it's not something that you own as the writer anymore. It's sort of like, it's somebody else I have to consider. And I knew this was going to happen, but suddenly it's confronted me for the first time. Like someone might have a different memory of what I'm writing about, my child will, not someone, my child will. And that's new. That's a new experience, where all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, I should make sure that he's okay with some of this stuff, Like you write about an infant, that is the photograph that you show them later. But while they're living, it becomes something different, right?
Catriona, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely totally. I read some of them and I remember life feeling just like so intense at that time. It's just this kind of separate time in your life, and everything seems very monumentous and important. And it's actually hard for me to kind of really feel back the way I did. So I'm glad I wrote the poems because they do kind of record my emotional state at that time. Like nothing feels as intense as it did at the time. So I'm glad I have those poems to look back on and remember.
Oh yeah, sorry, Catriona. I just sometimes when you said I recorded those events, sometimes I get worried myself because memory being fickle, and you write a poem that's just a slice of your emotional palette at that time. But then the poem becomes the memory, right? Then the poem becomes the photograph.
True.
And it's all you remember of that time, right? Like, and I worry about this with Augie. Like I'm selectively choosing these moments that then become the memory, whether they happen exactly that way or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you both anticipate to keep writing about this kind of stuff as your kids get older? Like Matt, you said already that your kid is starting to become more cognizant of this stuff. So I just want to wrap up here by saying, like, do we anticipate we're going to keep doing this, or at some point it's just going to be too cringy for our kids to know we write poems about them?
Interrupting. I mean, honestly, my kid isn't even 3 yet, so it's still an all-encompassing part of my life and takes up many, many, many hours of my day and probably all the hours of my like waking life thinking about it. So, yeah, I think I'll probably still keep writing about it.
Matt?
I think it changes, though. Like, so part of my book is also writing about myself and my own childhood and my own teen years and adulthood. And I realized that the teen years are very difficult to write about. They're kind of cliched in a way that you cannot get away from. Like, I know, Catriona, you have a few in your book that managed to do that, but only a couple, right? Like, you don't want to get too many because so I can see a point where, like, what Augie's doing is, or what he's going through or whatever, is so common that it's just hard to find a way in, you know, like, but I imagine, Augie's going to be part of my life forever and is always going to crop up in the poems, just because things that are in your life crop up in your poems, right?
Catriona, Matthew, thank you for appearing on the Coach House podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
And that's our show. If you like the Coach House podcast, please share it with your friends. Like, really, please share it with your friends online or whatever, whoever you like to share it with, just do it. We really, really appreciate it. The Coach House podcast is produced by Andrew Kaufman under the loving guidance of Alana Wilcox. My name is James Lindsay. Take care, and I hope to see you at the Ways Goose September 5th at 80 BP Nickel Lane in Toronto.